The healer's quarter smelled of crushed mint and boiling roots, and Alira Vantane had grown used to being invisible inside that smell. For 6 years, she had worked among the sick and the poor of the capital, grinding herbs, wrapping wounds, and staying far away from anything that carried the word royal. She had learned, long before she understood why, that some words followed people like shadows, and some shadows could get a person killed. Every morning, before the sun touched the rooftops of the city, she measured out a small spoon of gray powder and let it dissolve under her tongue. It tasted like burnt paper and old smoke, and it always left a dull ache behind her eyes. She had done this every single day since she was a child, ever since the old guard named Corwin had carried her out of a palace that was burning behind them, and told her, in a voice she never forgot, that she must never let anyone smell what she truly was. She did not remember her parents. She did not remember the coup that ended the Vantane line 17 years ago, the one history books now spoke of only in careful, distant sentences. What she remembered was Corwin's hands shaking as he mixed her first dose of masking herb, and his whispered promise that the herb would keep her safe as long as she never missed a day. She had not missed a day in 17 years, until the night everything changed. It began with a fever that swept through the lower city like a hungry wind. 3 days and 3 nights, Alira barely slept. She moved from house to house with her small leather satchel, pressing cool cloths to burning foreheads, boiling willow bark until her hands blistered, holding the hands of frightened mothers while their children shook with chills. By the 3rd night, her body was running on nothing but instinct and duty. It was instinct and duty, not fear, that made her forget the spoon of gray powder sitting untouched on her windowsill. She did not even notice the mistake. She was too exhausted to notice anything except the messenger who arrived at her door near midnight, breathless and pale, saying that a diplomat inside the palace had collapsed after eating poisoned fruit, and that every healer in the city had already been called and failed, and that she was the last name left on the list. There was no time to think. There was only time to grab her satchel and run. The palace at night was a different world from the one she imagined when she passed its high walls during the day. Torches burned in long, silent corridors. Guards stood like statues at every turn. Alira followed a nervous steward through hallways lined with portraits of kings she had never learned the names of, her heart hammering with the kind of fear that came from being somewhere she did not belong. She reached the diplomat's chamber and worked quickly, the way Corwin had trained her to work. She forced a charcoal mixture down the man's throat to draw out the poison, then packed his stomach with warm cloths and waited, counting his pulse under her fingers, until it steadied from a frantic flutter into something closer to safe. By the time she stepped back from the bed, her hands were trembling, and her exhaustion had turned into something like a fog behind her eyes. She did not know, as she walked back through the corridor toward the exit, that something inside her had shifted the moment she missed her evening dose. The masking herb had been fading from her blood for hours, and without it, her body had quietly begun doing what it had always wanted to do. It had begun to breathe freely for the first time in 17 years. She felt only tired. She did not feel the change, but someone else did. King Draven Ashcombe had not been able to sleep that night. He rarely could. Since the day he took the throne from the ashes of a massacre he had never asked for, sleep had become a stranger to him, replaced instead by long hours spent walking the palace halls alone, turning over questions he could not ask out loud. He had ruled for 17 years with a steady hand and a closed heart, refusing to take a mate, refusing to let anyone close enough to see the doubt he carried like a second crown. He was walking past the guest wing when the scent hit him. It arrived without warning, the way lightning arrives before the sound of thunder, and it staggered him. He stopped mid-step, one hand pressed flat against the stone wall, his breath catching in his throat. It was not simply a pleasant scent. It was something ancient and commanding, a scent that spoke directly to the oldest part of him, the part that had nothing to do with crowns or councils, or 17 years of careful control. He had smelled something like it only once before, as a boy, standing outside the nursery of the Vantane heir, on the day she was born. He had been too young then to understand what he was smelling. He understood now. He moved down the corridor before he had decided to move, drawn forward the way a man is drawn toward warmth on a cold night, unable to stop himself even as every trained instinct in him screamed that this was dangerous, reckless, impossible. He found her at the end of the hall, a young woman in a healer's plain brown coat, her dark hair falling loose from its pins, her satchel clutched against her chest like a shield. She froze the moment she saw him, and he watched the color drain from her face as she realized, too late, what she must be giving off. "Who are you?" he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, edged with something he could not fully hide. "A healer, Your Majesty," she said quickly. "I was called to treat the diplomat. I am leaving now." She tried to step around him. He moved without thinking and blocked her path, close enough now that the scent wrapped around him fully, and for one dangerous moment, his mind went white and wordless, filled only with the overwhelming urge to pull her closer and never let her leave his sight again. He forced himself to breathe through his mouth, to plant his feet, to remember that he was a king before he was anything else. "What is your name?" he asked, quieter this time, though his hands had curled into fists at his sides. "Alira," she whispered, and then, because lying to a king felt suddenly impossible under that intense stare, she added nothing more. She did not need to. He already knew. "Vantane," he said, and it was not a question. She went pale as death. Her satchel slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a soft thud. For one terrible second, she thought about running, about screaming, about every nightmare Corwin had ever warned her against. But something in the king's face was not what she expected. There was no triumph there, no cruelty. There was something that looked almost like fear. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "Please, don't." "I am not going to hurt you," he said, and the words came out fast, urgent, as though he needed her to believe them before she could run. "I am not going to call the guards. Just stay, please." She should not have trusted him. Everything she had been taught told her not to trust a king, least of all the one who sat on the throne her family had lost. But exhaustion and fear had worn her down to something raw and honest, and when he gestured toward a small private study just off the corridor, she found herself following him inside instead of running the other way. He shut the door and turned to face her, keeping several careful feet of distance between them, as though he did not trust himself any closer. "How long?" he asked. "How long have you been hiding what you are?" "My whole life," she said. "A guard named Corwin took me out the night the palace burned. He raised me on masking herb. I take it every day. I have taken it every day for 17 years. Her voice cracked. "Except tonight. I forgot. There was a fever sweeping the lower city. And I forgot. And now you know. And I don't know what happens to me now." Draven closed his eyes briefly, as though her words had struck something deep and old inside him. When he opened them again, there was a rawness in his expression that surprised her. "I have spent 17 years wondering if someone survived," he said quietly. "I was 12 years old when the council came to me and told me the Vantane line was gone, that a terrible accident had taken them, and that the throne needed a steady hand. I believed them, because I was a child, and children believe what they are told. It was only later, as I grew older, that I began to notice things that did not add up. Documents that vanished. Guards who disappeared quietly in the years after. A council that grew more powerful. With every year I sat on that throne, using me as a shield for decisions I did not always agree with." "You think they did it," Alira said slowly. "You think your own council caused the fire." "I think," he said, "that I have been ruling a kingdom built on a lie I was too afraid to question, because questioning it might have cost me everything, including my life." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his gaze softened into something closer to wonder. "And now here you are, alive, in my palace, on the one night your scent finally broke free." The air between them felt heavy, charged with something neither of them fully understood yet. Alira wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how close he stood, how the pull between them felt less like fear and more like recognition, as though some part of her had been waiting her whole life for this exact moment without knowing it. "What happens now?" she asked softly. "That depends on you," he said. "I will not force anything on you. I will not drag you before the council and announce what you are, not until I understand who can be trusted and who cannot. Your life has been built on hiding, and I will not undo that carelessly." He hesitated, then added, quieter, "But I will not pretend that what happened in that corridor tonight was ordinary. My body recognized yours the moment I smelled you. That does not happen by chance. It happens once, for an alpha, if it happens at all." Alira's breath caught. She had heard stories of mates, of the instant and undeniable pull that bound certain shifters together for life, but she had never imagined it would happen to her, and certainly never with the king whose crown had come from her family's ashes. "I'm scared," she admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "Not just of the council, or of being discovered. I'm scared of wanting something I was taught my whole life to run from." "I understand that fear better than you know," Draven said. "I have spent 17 years refusing to take a mate, refusing to let anyone close enough to see the parts of me that doubt everything I have built. But I am done pretending tonight did not happen." He took a slow step closer, giving her every chance to step back if she wished. She did not. "I am asking you to trust me. Not blindly, not completely, not yet. Just enough to let me help you. Let me look into what really happened 17 years ago. Let me keep you safe while I do it." "And the herb?" she asked. "The masking herb. It has been making me sick for years. Corwin never told me how much damage it might be doing." "Stop taking it," he said firmly. "Whatever comes next, you should not have to poison yourself to survive it. Not anymore. Not while I am here." The night stretched on as they talked. Two people who had spent their entire lives building walls, suddenly finding those walls quietly, carefully, coming down. By the time the first gray light of dawn touched the windows, they had not solved 17 years of buried secrets, and they had not resolved the pull that hummed steadily between them, but something had shifted all the same. An uneasy alliance had formed, built on the fragile beginning of trust. Alira returned to a small guest chamber the king insisted she use, too tired to argue, and stood before the mirror for a long moment, studying her own reflection. For the first time in 17 years, her scent belonged entirely to her, unmasked and unhidden, and instead of fear, she felt something unfamiliar settle quietly in her chest, something close to relief. Outside her door, though she did not know it yet, Draven Ashcombe stood in the corridor, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the wood as though he could see through it. He was no longer thinking like a king, weighing political danger. He was thinking like a man who had waited his whole life without knowing it, and who had finally found the one thing he refused to lose again. He did not knock, he simply stayed, keeping watch through the last hours of the night, silently promising the girl behind that door that whatever came next, whatever the council had done, whatever truth still needed uncovering, she would never have to disappear again.